For 14 years, Paul has been struggling with this thorn in his flesh, and it probably afflicted him until the day of his death. The source, the text says, was a messenger of Satan to torment Paul. Scholars expect that this thorn in Paul's flesh was either malaria, perhaps poor eyesight, perhaps even more of a debilitating health condition. Other scholars have thought it could be perpetual persecution that he was under, this thorn in his flesh. And Paul says it was his yoke to bear because it kept him from becoming conceited. Do you know anyone who's conceited? Who wants to be in a long-term relationship with someone who's conceited? Could you imagine a pastor who's conceited, or reporting to someone at work who's just conceited? Webster's definition is having or showing an excessively high opinion of oneself. And Paul says in Romans 12:3, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but think of yourself with sober judgment. I don't know why God chose to use Satan to deliver this thorn in Paul's flesh, yet we understand from Scripture that God is sovereign, and that God actually volunteered Job to Satan, who consequently experienced agonizing suffering in his health and loss of possessions and all of his children. In Job 19:9, Job says, "He, with a capital H, has set darkness in my paths." Martin Luther said once that you have to experience God as an enemy before you can know him as a friend. Jay Kessler, the president of the university that Pastor Owen and I attended together, once said that if I understood everything about God, he wouldn't be much of a God, would he? Philip Yancey shares in his writing that God is beyond our understanding, that he is free, and that humility must count more than anything. Abraham Lincoln suffered with a debilitating depression, and we remember him as Honest Abe. He actually read the Bible completely through 3 times by the time he was 10 years old. My Bible has a commentary on Paul's vision and this thorn in his flesh, highlighting that the supreme height to which he was raised through these ecstatic experiences was counterbalanced by the humbling depth of a particular affliction he was given to bear, so that he should continue to glory not in self, but only in the God of all grace. It was an experience that must have given incalculable strength to his apostleship, which involved him in such constant and extreme suffering. I heard Pastor Chuck Swindoll say on his radio program, Insight for Living Ones, and this is my paraphrase, I realized that Jesus never promised his followers a lavish retirement, a private Christian education for their children, but only to be misunderstood and persecuted. I also heard Chuck Swindoll say in one of his sermons that you won't find a mature Christian believer anywhere who doesn't struggle with a daily pain in their neck. Johnny Erickson Tada struggled to accept God's design in her paralysis after a driving accident, yet came to the conclusion that her wheelchair was required and worth her witness for God's kingdom. Sometimes we have to be pinned down by God in order to be supernaturally effective. Gary Thomas writes in his book, Sacred Pathways, that there's something especially holy about the handicapped. My chronological study Bible underscores the ministry of the prophet Jeremiah by saying that there was a wrenching cry from a man who never wanted to be a prophet, but who could not stop, from a messenger whose greatness as a prophet is only magnified by his human frailty. I heard a Christian say once that he felt closest to God when he was suffering. In Job 2:10, Job says to his wife, "Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Another commentary at this point in my Bible underscores that trouble and suffering are not merely punishment for sin. For God's people, they may serve as a trial or as a discipline that culminates in spiritual gain. Verse 9 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we just read that my grace is sufficient for you, God said, for my power is made perfect in weakness. What a paradox. And once again, my Bible notes for this verse that this is a better solution than to remove Paul's thorn in his flesh. Human weakness provides the ideal opportunity for the display of divine power. If you think about the human power behind Wall Street or Hollywood, for example, the people with the beauty and the people with the money often have very little room for the display of divine power. I don't think they need it. Do you happen to get the Christian radio station Life 102.5, the Whitewater WNWC? Okay. So, thank you. Several years ago, I thought there was a very relevant illustration on this radio program that had to do with an oyster. And I think it's relevant to the thorn in the flesh, where what happens is there's an irritation from a grain of sand against the soft tissue of the oyster that creates one of nature's most beautiful products, a pearl. Psalms 119 is the longest chapter in the Bible, and the author demonstrates a raw passion throughout for observing God's law and the importance of doing so and living blamelessly. And the central part of the chapter, I think, reveals the author's secret. Psalm 119:67 says, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray. But now I keep your word." Continuing through verses 71 and 75, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. I know, O Lord, that your judgments are right, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted me." Jacob's very name meant deceiver. He fought with his twin brother Esau before they were even born. I'm glad that's not happening for you. He stole his inheritance. He lied to his father. But then God got a hold of Jacob, didn't he? By literally wrestling with him in the form of an angel all night long. And as Jacob wrestled back with God, he wrenched Jacob's hip, causing a physical limp that served as a reminder in his spiritual walk. That very day, Jacob saw his brother Esau for the first time in literally decades. And how did he address him after stealing his birthright? He called himself Esau's servant that day. And the remaining biblical accounts of Jacob are filled with only prayers of humility, a life of integrity, an honest representation with his family, even with an Egyptian governor who he did not know was his own son. Samson's ministry, on the other hand, was out of control. He did not maintain a thorn in his flesh, as far as we know. He had superhuman strength that he used most often for his own purposes and glory, not always aligned with God's. He never did learn discernment with women and used the power God had given him based on impulses and temperament, and oftentimes for his own revenge. It took Samson's enemies to remove his eyesight before he developed a thorn in his flesh that finally led him to utter the first recorded prayer of humility in his life when he said, "Oh, sovereign Lord, remember me." Samson could have done so much more as an army of one for God and wouldn't have needed to meet such a tragic end if he could have understood earlier in his life what Paul learned, that God's power is made perfect in weakness. As part of my onboarding for my ministry with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, I was required actually to participate in an evangelism outreach in Madison. Luke, did you experience something like that as well? Okay, all right, it's part of our culture. Fantastic. And I wrote about this experience that I had with one specific encounter with someone who I'd never met, obviously. In the summer of 2012, this occurred, and I wrote in my prayer letter to donors that we then met Kendall, reading a book on top of the Monona Terrace, overlooking beautiful Lake Monona. Kendall could be described as having it all. The perfect job, she shared, the perfect marriage. She had beauty and intelligence, a close family, and her self-described feeling of contentment. We shared the story of the prodigal son with her, and she didn't see how that would apply to her and didn't believe that God would send anyone to hell. Kendall's heart was not open that day, and yet she said thanks for witnessing to her and that my testimony was interesting. As my partner and I walked away feeling like we hit a wall with Kendall, we realized that unless God had allowed significant trials in our own lives, that we would be just like Kendall, thinking we did not need God and trusting in ourselves. Kendall taught me what Jesus meant when he said in John 12:25, anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. A couple years ago, I happened to be in a period of my life when I had kept myself from willful sin as long as I could remember. And my wife and I were very excited to be expecting our second child. And when we went in for the first ultrasound, we learned that there was something wrong with our baby. And later that day, additional tests confirmed that this young unborn baby had a terminal health condition and probably would not be born alive. And so we prayed faithfully for a miracle and exhausted all possible medical treatments. And a friend of mine wrote to me during this time and said, "It's an extraordinary situation. How do we understand God's purposes? But if we believe He is sovereign, then He is sovereign in all circumstances. And we are left with ruthless trust. Is that what He wants from us? I think He wants trust as much as belief. Keep praying," my friend said. "The resultant prayer may be more profound than the circumstances. Nothing mitigates the pain. It still hurts," he ended this email. When our baby girl, named Azaliah, was 6 months old, she died. And I didn't understand why this young girl, who we had never met, that we loved so much, why we didn't have the opportunity to raise her, while so many voluntarily end their pregnancies. And in our grief, we met with an InterVarsity chaplain. And he shared with us that there's something about the theology of suffering. And he said that in this circumstance, it was more important for my wife and I to experience the suffering than the opportunity to raise our own child. God can define a blessing 180 degrees differently than we do. Most of us are probably familiar with the C.S. Lewis quote from his book, The Problem of Pain. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. C.S. Lewis wrote another book that helped him cope with his own loss of his wife, that is full of theological reflections, and it's entitled A Grief Observed. I think that 7 words summarize the profound theme in this book. Only torture will bring out the truth. Job went as far as to say in Job 13:15, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." Once in a spiritual conversation with my wife, she shared with me that we serve a God who tortured his own son to death. In Luke 23, verses 39 through 43, we read about the account of the 2 criminals that were crucified on either side of Jesus. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth, today you will be with me in paradise." Torture brings out the truth in us. In James chapter 5, verses 10 through 11, we read, "Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord has finally brought about." I once read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, searching for the common denominator in answered prayer. And what I learned from the Bible was that there is a prerequisite to answered prayer, a humility that incorporates an obedience to God's purposes. All the way through the Bible, there are consistent warnings and judgment for the proud. In James 4:6, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Isaiah 56:15 says, "I will dwell in the high and holy place with him who has a contrite and a humble spirit." Isaiah 66:2, the theme continues, "But on this one will I look, on him who is poor and of a contrite spirit." Contrite means feeling or showing sorrow and remorse for a sin or a shortcoming. "And who trembles at my word," the verse ends. Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Part of my encouragement for you this morning is to accept the humility that God has bestowed upon you, whatever that might be. It's your only hope for a ministry to experience answered prayer and ultimately for salvation. Psalms 149:4 says, "He will beautify the humble with salvation." Isn't that a marvelous verse? He will beautify the humble with salvation. Paul accepted this thorn in his flesh to the point where he says in verse 10, "That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecution, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." This is the attitude of a mature Christian. Regarding Paul's concern for the Corinthians, verses 11 through 21, Paul had performed many miracles, and yet this thorn in his flesh prevented him from boasting about them. I have an InterVarsity Press Bible commentary on the New Testament, and in verse 21, this commentary I have highlights that the powerful members of the Corinthian church despised humility, as did most of their pagan colleagues. But if they were worried that Paul had been too humble before, their wretched spiritual state is about to humiliate him further. Paul was aware of their quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, factions, slander, and gossip. I heard a definition of gossip once as hearing something you like about someone you don't. Arrogance and disorder was added to this list of sins. And Paul's primary concern was for those who hadn't repented of the impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery in which they have indulged. The PG meaning of debauchery is engaging in extreme indulgence and in sensuality. I was in a lunch conversation with a Bible-believing Christian friend several years ago, and we were discussing many of the problems with the modern church. And when I expressed my misunderstanding of the attitudes and behaviors of the church being parallel with so many of the world's, especially in this list of impurity, sexual sin, and debauchery, my friend insightfully responded, "Eric, that's not the church." As we work towards conclusion this morning, Paul's thorn in his flesh paradoxically enabled him to have a prolific ministry that culminated in his writing of over half of the New Testament. What is your thorn in your flesh? Will you allow your thorn to pierce your body to the point of your soul, as Paul did? And if you haven't developed a thorn in your flesh yet, maybe much of this message you have not identified with. Well, someday you will. You will not always be healthy. What weaknesses do you have that can perfect God's power? And after you've prayed for something fervently 3 times, asking God to take it away, will you accept that God's grace is sufficient for you and that His power is made perfect in weakness? Are you willing to accept that you may not be delivered from this thorn and your weaknesses, but that they are core to your ministry and relationship with God? I pray you do.